All right, so for this section of notes, we're going to cover the presidencies of Taft and Wilson. So let's present. All right, so what you need to know beginning in this section is that Teddy Roosevelt, does not run for a third term. Up until this point in time, there was nothing in the Constitution that said the presidents could not run for a third time. It was just something, it was tradition. It was not until the 22nd Amendment of Roosevelt's family member, Franklin Roosevelt, who ran for 4 terms in office, that they created an amendment to the Constitution that limited the president's terms. So, Roosevelt, he supported William Taft. He hoped that Taft would continue his programs. And then it says that Taft became a Republican nominee and won the 1908 presidential election. So this is William Taft. This is a cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt. And then it shows Taft, and it shows him passing off a baby. Notice it says, "My policies." Okay. So, Republican Party splits. At this point in time, we've talked a little bit about political parties because we've mentioned the progressives. Okay, we've mentioned conservatives. So the progressives, it says they wanted change, but the conservatives did not. Through the Payne-Aldrich tariff, a compromise that Taft signed, it created what we know as the Payne bill. It said it lowered tariffs. And the Senate had proposed that they would increase tariffs. So there was anger between the House and the Senate, okay? The House was comprised of progressives. The Senate was comprised or made up of conservatives. And the progressives were angry because tariffs increased. So if you don't know what a tariff is a tax on something that is coming into the country. Okay, so that means if you were to import anything from another country, a tariff is a tax that is placed on that. So for any other country who is trying to trade with the United States, it's a tax on imports. So, with the split of the Republican Party, it says conservatives were furious when Taft appointed Richard Ballinger as Secretary of the Interior. Ballinger was a wealthy lawyer who did not support environmental conservation. And if you remember, Teddy Roosevelt was a huge supporter of environmental conservation. So we also have Gifford Pinot, who is head of U.S. Forest Service. He viewed Ballinger as a threat. It says that businesses pressured Taft to open up protected land to development. Ballinger opened up 1 million acres. So this was an issue. Pinot criticized Ballinger, and then Taft removed Pinot from his position. The progressives were outraged. Okay, because basically it was a new guy, in town, starts doing a lot of things that people aren't happy with. And then, of course, Taft, who is the president, does have the power to remove these people from office. Now, we also have Latin American involvement, and this is where Taft gets involved in Latin America. Taft intervened in Latin American affairs for the benefit of the United States. He believed the United States needed to create stability in the Western Hemisphere so the U.S. economic interests would flourish. So he was all about trading, right? He wanted to keep the Eastern Hemisphere countries out of the Western Hemisphere. This allowed the U.S. government to guarantee loans made to Latin American countries by American businessmen and banks. This was known as dollar diplomacy. Critics said it did not provide economic or political stability in Latin American countries. Instead, revolutions broke out, which were basically people trying to overthrow the government or different things, in Latin American countries, because they did not like U.S. interference. So the United States had to send troops down to these Latin American countries to protect the American interests. Now, this is all part of, remember, keep in mind this section is imperialism. So you need to understand that this is where America is trying to kind of get its hands in other countries where some would argue it didn't belong. Okay? Nicaragua. So Nicaragua, if you look here on the map, it is part of Central America. This is the United States. This is Mexico. And then there are several Central American countries that make up this area. And then, of course, you've got South America. So the United States was concerned about Nicaragua's president, Jose Zelaya. Zelaya came to power in a military coup in 1893. Now, what you need to know about a military coup. This is the same way that when we get into World War One, this is the same coup that basically kind of takes over. Well, it's not the same, but you see what I'm saying? It's a military coup. The same thing happened in Russia. All right. So a military coup just means that you have a certain amount of people who can use force to overthrow the existing president or whoever is in power. And that way a new system of government or a new, usually it's going to be somebody who is kind of like a dictator, comes in and is now in charge. So this happened in Russia, okay, because after the, I'm trying to think of their family's name, but after the Tsar of Russia and his family was assassinated, this coup attempt, which was successful, they now brought in communism, which, we'll get into that a little bit later. So, Zelaya in Nicaragua welcomed foreign investment in Nicaragua. The United States did not want other countries to be allowed to invest, so the United States wanted to just take it all to themselves. So 2 U.S. citizens were captured and executed, and so in return, the United States invaded Nicaragua in 1911. Adolfo Diaz was elected new president, but the country was economically devastated. So when the United States came in and invaded, they overthrew Zelaya. Diaz was elected the new president, but the economy of the country was devastated, and that means that they were in despair. Continuing. So Taft, he allows American bankers to loan money to Nicaragua. Nicaragua allowed the bankers to collect the debts by taking their custom duties. Duties are also a tax on customs. So whenever you were to bring something into the country or take something out, they would tax you. So it says American bankers gained control of Nicaragua's railroad systems and its national bank. So should that have actually happened? Probably not. Nicaraguans were angered by a deal and revolted against Diaz. So, again, the United States sent 2,000 troops to end the revolt, and the U.S. troops remained until 1933. So, realistically, is this something that the United States should have been involved in? Probably not. And if you notice here this political cartoon, it says the pull of the Monroe Magnet. And if you notice, again, this is Uncle Sam that we see all the time. His legs are made to look like a magnet. And this is what this says Mexico, okay? So they're pulling their, resources and finances and everything to, what does his pants say? Protection, United States. Yeah. You might be able to zoom in and see on that a little bit better, but you get the gist of it. In my opinion, the United States shouldn't have been involved in that. But again, this is all about American imperialism. That means they're trying to, take over and be involved in a lot of different areas around the world, and we'll see more of that in just a second. So, the achievements of Taft's presidency, because we always have to talk about what are these presidents known for. He broke up twice as many trusts as Roosevelt. Now, some of you probably are struggling with this idea of a trust, okay, or a monopoly. Now, it's kind of, we talked some about the different monopolies that were involved in the Industrial Revolution. You had the iron, steel workers, okay, you had oil, things like that. But for you to understand what a trust is in 2020, you need to consider Disney, okay? Or you can even consider social media like Facebook, okay? Think about how many different areas Facebook is involved in. Facebook now owns, obviously, Facebook. They also own Instagram. So they have become what is known as a trust or a monopoly because they are a monopoly of the news. A lot of people get their information from social media. And if Facebook decides what gets published on Instagram or Facebook, that means they decide what people are going to see. The same thing with Disney. Disney owns now Oh gosh, you can Google this. I want you to go and Google and see what different companies Disney actually owns, because they are a lot more than just themselves. I want to say they are owning that they own ABC News, but I'm not sure. So you might have to fact check me on that. But those are two examples of trusts, which are also monopolies. So Taft, what he did, and remember Roosevelt as well, they wanted to break up these trusts because they felt that it was not economically fair. Okay, when somebody controls every aspect of something, it's not fair to the public, and it's also not fair to small businesses who are trying to just come up, okay? Another thing that Taft did is he limited the workday of federal employees to 8 hours. He also supported the 16th Amendment, which allowed Congress to levy a federal income tax, and he supported the 17th Amendment, which allowed citizens to directly vote for U.S. senators. Now, if you ever hear me use the word popular vote, that means you as a citizen go and actually cast a ballot. Okay? Popular means the people. Let me take a sip of my water. Okay. So now we have the Bull Moose Party. The funny thing about this time period here, okay, Teddy Roosevelt got his feelings hurt. He didn't run for a third term. However, now since he sees this big mess that he considers a big mess of what Taft is doing during his presidency, he decides that he wants to run again. Well, the problem is you can't have two people running on the Republican Party ticket, and you can't have two people running for a Democrat on the Democratic ticket, okay? They select one person, that's it. And since Taft is a Republican, that is who they selected. So Roosevelt decides that he's going to make his own political party, which he names the Bull Moose Party. He believed that he could unite the country, and Taft did not remain loyal to progressive beliefs, because remember, Roosevelt was a progressive, okay? Roosevelt blamed Taft for the Republican Party split. He felt that he had the progressive Republican support, and that Taft had the support of the conservatives. Progressive Republicans formed their own party led by Roosevelt, which was nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. And again, if you look here, they are making fun of Taft. They have put him in a dress. All alone, nobody here but me. Trying to signify that they have all left the party, okay? Continuing on. This is kind of an outline of what Roosevelt wanted to accomplish if he were elected to a third term. The main part is he wanted a plan for social reform. He called it New Nationalism. Also, a federal trade commission that would monitor business practices. He wanted a higher minimum wage, workers' compensation or workers' comp, and child labor laws, which these are all very progressive ideas. Okay. He also wanted government pension plans for retirees, which that actually will happen a little bit later. Not for him, though. He didn't create this. But he also wanted to fund a fund to help Americans with health care costs. He supported the women's suffrage amendment. He also wanted direct elections of senators by citizens, which we know that's the 17th Amendment. He also pushed for the adoption of initiatives, referendums, and recall votes in states. If you remember, we talked about that a little bit during the Progressive era. So these are not bad concepts that he's pushing for. They're pretty reasonable, right? Now, I have a bone to pick here because, most of you probably don't care about, different presidents and things like that. But if I had to pick somebody who I just couldn't stand, like I just can't stand his policies, really, I probably would consider him one of the worst presidents that we've had is Woodrow Wilson. Not a fan, okay? But, you can make your decision later. So this was the 1912 election. Woodrow Wilson became the 28th president. This was after Taft, so Taft lost. The Democratic Party took advantage of the Republican Party split because, of course, when you have people who are not unified together, it's very easy to take advantage of somebody. Wilson was governor of New Jersey who passed several reform bills, and he called his reform programs the New Freedom. He supported small businesses and farmers. He believed in tariffs, banks, and trust, and he thought that they were threats to the American people, nicknamed the Triple Wall of Privilege. Okay? So we now have the 16th Amendment. This is the thing that a lot of people argue is actually unconstitutional, but they found a way. So with the passage of the 16th Amendment, you can now thank him and a lot of other people during this time, because this is where we get the income tax. So this means that every year during April, you have to file your income taxes. This is where we get that. This is the 16th Amendment. So they signed the Underwood-Simmons Act in 1913. It reduced tariffs for the first time since the Civil War. Lower tariffs meant the U.S. government needed to replace a loss of income. So if you lower tariffs because you're making money off of products that are coming into the United States, if you lower tariffs in an effort to boost trade, you've got to figure out where you're going to make up that money other places. Because, guys, I've told you, the United States does not have money, okay? Money comes from taxes, and it comes from any kind of tax either on its citizens or on other countries that they're doing business with. So, since they lost money through lowering tariffs, they had to figure out where they were going to get it from, and that's where we get the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, again, which legalized a graduated federal income tax, which means it's not stable. It means it changes. And they recently went back and, was this a year ago, 2 years ago, where they have changed now the tax brackets. I know this sounds like a lot. You can ask your parents about the tax brackets and, just income tax in general. Definitely when you get to my government class, we talk about taxes, because a lot of you who have part-time jobs may have to file your taxes. We'll discuss. So, according to this, individuals and businesses would be taxed based on annual earnings. Annual means every year. Larger incomes taxed at a higher rate. So, if you make more money, you are taxed more money. Okay, so from 1 to 6%. By 1917, the U.S. government had more money from incomes tax than it ever had from tariffs. And a lot of people, like I said, felt like this was illegal. But, here we are. Banking reform. Okay, so during this time, Americans lost faith in the banking system because of loss of homes, businesses, and life savings during Depression periods. So, December 23rd, 1913, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. It established a decentralized private banking system under federal control, and we still have the Federal Reserve today. It provided the country with a safer, more flexible, and more stable financial system. It also divided the country into 12 districts with its own regional bank. So, if you look here, this is the picture. And it set up regional reserve banks, which set interest rates, safeguarded cash reserves, and provided available cash when needed. All right. We're not going to focus too much on this, but you just need to know. Trust busting. So again, remember the monopolies and the trusts. Wilson viewed all trusts as dangerous. So they created the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. It strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. It named specific business tactics illegal, purposely forming a monopoly. It declared unions and farm organizations had a right to exist and were not subject to antitrust laws. It also declared strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing legal. Now we get to the 1916 presidential election. So, this is again a map of the Electoral College voting in 1916. The Democrats are red, the Republicans are blue. Okay, that's switched, obviously. The colors now, Republicans are red, Democrats are blue. So just when you look at the new election coming up in 2020, just know that these colors have switched. Okay, I know it's going to look confusing. But again, for the 2020 election, Republicans are red, Democrats are blue. So, in the 1916 presidential election, they needed to gain support of progressive Republicans. They signed many of Roosevelt's Bull Moose legislative proposals to create the Federal Trade Commission to watch over business practices, which we still have today. They also signed Child Labor Bill and Workers' Compensation Act into law, so therefore that limited the amount of hours or really the age that a child could work. And I told you, you should know what workers' comp is if any of you have a job. If you get hurt on the job, you can file for workers' comp and they will pay your hospital bills. Now, you also have to make sure you were not influenced. Okay, I should say. So, it also limited the workday of interstate railroad workers to 8 hours, signed Federal Farm Loan Act, it helped small farmers, and as a result of all of these different things, Wilson eventually wins the 1916 election. We get into women's suffrage. Now again, women's suffrage is not literal suffering. It means the right to vote, okay? So, in the 1920, we have the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Well, let me make sure I didn't skip one. Okay, I did not. So, it gave women the right to vote. Later, when the United States will join World War I, women become involved in the war effort. So, what they do is they headed committees, knitted socks, and held food drives. So, this is an example. The War Bread Wagon. This is New York City Food Aid Committee. And you see some women here who are on the truck. It says, watch for this truck in your district. Okay. And again, this is a picture of the American Red Cross. All right, African American disappointment. Oh, okay. So Wilson, again, he promised to treat African Americans equally and speak out against lynching during his 1912 campaign. If you don't know what lynching is, I will let you Google that. I'm not going to explain that, okay? He also had support for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. However, he does not keep his promises. Again, another reason why I don't care for this guy. He put segregationists in charge of federal agencies. Now, someone who is a segregationist means that they want the races to be separate, which is not okay. It says these offices had been desegregated during Reconstruction, but he basically set everybody back because he just resegregated the whole thing. He also opposed federal anti-lynching legislation. He felt that it was a state issue, not federal, which means he didn't do anything to solve it. He just threw it back to the states. And if you remember, the states, who were mainly run by Democrats, supported this because they were generally, leading the charge against segregation. So he didn't help. As a result, African Americans and white liberals were outraged. Wilson said that he was acting in the best interest of African Americans. However, he did not seem to be, okay? On November 12, 1914, an African American delegation arrived at the White House. It was led by William Monroe Trotter to remind Wilson of these promises that he supposedly made during his campaign and when he first became elected. All these things that he said he was going to do, but he didn't do. Wilson became offended, and he asked the delegation to leave. So now we get into more of these Latin American involvement, again, on this idea of American imperialism. So in 1913, we have what is known as missionary diplomacy or moral diplomacy. So this is the idea that the United States looked at themselves as like better than other countries. And again, this was not everybody. This was just like a certain amount of people, right? So again, this certain amount of people that I'm discussing, these are people who are, in charge of the government. It's not the general population. Most of these people were just hardworking Americans who really didn't pay attention that much. But you have the United States government who felt that they had a moral obligation to not recognize any Latin American government it viewed as oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to U.S. interests. So that kind of gives the idea that, unless they're on board with what the United States wants to do, they're not considered a government. We're not going to recognize them as a country, okay? So this pressured Latin American countries to establish democratic governments. And if you look here, these are some cartoons, political cartoons that kind of show, all right, if you see here, it looks like Taft is throwing what appears to be a baby, a Latin American man, a baby to Wilson. And again, we see here, this is Uncle Sam. Can't tell, what is that, a dog? Can't tell what that is. It says Mexican Revolution and Monroe Doctrine, all right? So we get to Mexico. This is Mexico. All right. So, 1911. I know we're kind of flip-flopping here with the time, so just kind of pay attention here. So, 1911, we have the Mexican Revolution, which replaced Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz with Francisco Madero. Diaz had ruled Mexico for more than 30 years, and he had allowed Americans to invest in Mexican mines, oil wells, railroads, and ranches. Most Mexicans at that point in time were poor. However, Madero promised democratic reforms, but he was unable to unite the country. So again, this is Diaz, and this is Madero. In 1913, General Victoriano Huerta took control of the government. And again, this kind of is, you see this is a little coup here because Madero was murdered within days. Wilson called Huerta's government a government of butchers, and he refused to recognize Huerta's government, citing missionary diplomacy. Now, we're going to see this kind of stuff happen throughout the world, okay? Another example of this when we get into Vietnam War, South Vietnam. So we'll discuss this later. Again, with Mexico. This is Huerta, Victoriano Huerta. So, in 1914, a small group of American sailors were arrested in Tampico, Mexico. They immediately released an apology, and Wilson used it as an excuse. When I say they, I'm talking about Mexico releases an apology, but Wilson doesn't buy it. He orders U.S. Marines to occupy Veracruz, which was an important Mexico port, which means it kind of shut off their trading. At this point in time, the United States and Mexico were at war because that is considered an act of war. You basically came down and took over a port. Brazil, Argentina, and Chile tried to mediate, which means they tried to get involved and lessen the conflict, but it did not work. In 1915, Huerta's government collapsed, and I might get this wrong, but Venustiano Carranza became president after, and this is him. Oh, okay. And then Wilson withdrew troops, and he, of course, recognized the government after that. So he is going to be a more democratic leader. This was more of a, authoritarian, and we'll get into all of these different terms when you take my government class. It's kind of hard to explain all in just one PowerPoint here. I'm already at 28 minutes. Mexico. Again, with Mexico. So, we have Francisco Pancho Villa, who opposes Carranza, and Villa is angry with the United States. He threatens the U.S. In January of 1916, Carranza invites American engineers to operate Mexican mines. So, this angers them because, again, when you're inviting some other citizens to your area to operate your mines, that means that you're not, your people don't have jobs. So that's where the tension was created. Villa kidnapped and shot the Americans. So in March, Villa's men raided Columbus, New Mexico, and they killed about 20 Americans. So again, this was, this is part of America at this point. So this is a result. Again, we are in kind of a dispute. So Wilson sends General John J. Pershing and 150,000 troops to Mexico to kill or capture Villa. Mexicans did not like the invasion because obviously, you can't just send federal troops down to another country for this kind of secretive mission here. We do that now, but you don't send that many troops. It's just kind of anyway. So Mexicans did not like the invasion, and in June, the U.S. troops fought against Carranza's. Carranza demanded removal of troops, and Wilson refused. this is what's going to happen. In 1917, Wilson calls back Pershing because of World War One, and it's kind of left, they don't really finish it. Now, we'll get into where Mexico stands in World War One later. The Progressive Era ends. It ended during Wilson's second term. World War I breaks out in 1914 in Europe. The United States remains neutral. However, because of Wilson, the United States joins World War I, and the Progressive Era ends. One of the things, the biggest mistakes, in my opinion, I'll stop here. Personally, I didn't feel the United States needed to be involved in World War I. It was kind of us sticking our business into areas that we shouldn't be involved in. Again, this is the idea of American imperialism. So, I'll have to get into this when we get into the World War I section. But stopping here, there we go.